This documentary is centered around one of the most famous dictators of this century, Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro led Cuba through a social revolution and led Cuba to be a major actor throughout the Cold War. Throughout Cuba's history, the U.S. and the USSR played a large role in its governance. However, Fidel Castro, the dictator during and after the Cold War, had a power in his own right. In 1998, the United States took Cuba and other Spanish colonies after winning the Spanish-American War. This time has been categorized as the birth of American imperialism. After a 4-year military occupation, Cuba gained independence in 1902, 400 years after they were colonized by the Spanish. The United States granted independence on the condition that their constitution would allow the U.S. to step in. The United States kept its eye on Cuba in the 50 years of the Cuban Republic, using military support to intervene a few times to make sure Cuba continued to support American interest. In 1952, General Fulgencio Batista came to power in a dictatorship backed by the U.S. The years under the United States-controlled republic and Batista led to a stratified Cuban society, illiteracy in 1/3 of the adult population, intense violence and cruelty, and thus was all under Batista. Cuba was ready for a revolution. Following the military coup led by Fulgencio Batista in 1952 that was backed by the United States, Fidel Castro led a coup against Batista's power in 1953. The failed attack took place in the Moncada garrison and led to Castro being sentenced to 15 years in jail. Despite this, he was released in 1955 and continued his fight against Batista's regime. In 1956, Castro led a guerrilla war against Batista's control, and by 1959, he had risen to power and taken over Cuba. Castro freed Cuba from being a puppet that acts in the interest of the United States. So, when Castro took control of Cuba, he developed a Marxist-Leninist ideology as a result of growing U.S. hostility towards Cuba. And in order to receive military protection from the U.S., Castro formed an alliance with the Soviet Union. Due to Cuba's status as a new republic, it did not have a stable leader during its first few years of independence, and the country was susceptible to corruption. There was a disproportionate level of income and education among its people, and then in 1959, the people of Cuba revolted and began forming the first socialist government in South and North America. The new state of Cuba made the U.S. uneasy, as they were already in a dispute with the USSR via the Cold War. Cuba's growth towards socialism led the U.S. to cut off ties, which included limiting sugar imports and the use of international Cuban companies. This led Cuba to seek relations with the USSR and oil production companies. The U.S. intervened even further and initiated the Bay of Pigs invasion with the intention of removing Castro from power. They believed him to be the root of the socialist movement in Cuba. However, the invasion failed, and Castro made clear that there was major USSR influence in the country. And he declared that the socialist cause was Marxist-Leninist, both Marx and Lenin both being USSR leaders. And through that, an alliance was made between the Republic of Cuba and the USSR, which began the production and harboring of Soviet-made missiles in Cuba. The U.S. attempted to intercept missile shipments via naval blockade, and succeeded in preventing the escalation of the Cold War into something that was nuclear. But they did forfeit any hold on Cuba as the country was now affiliated with the USSR and also guarded by them. Due to this new relationship between Cuba and the USSR, both the administrations of Kennedy and Eisenhower placed embargoes upon the country. Eisenhower had ordered all U.S. oil refineries operating on Cuba to halt oil refining, and the U.S. eventually canceled Cuban sugar imports as well. Following this, Castro nationalized all businesses, refineries, and farms previously owned by the United States. In April 1961, the CIA's Bays of Pigs invasion caused Castro to solidify the alliance with the USSR. After the USSR found out that the U.S. had Jupiter missiles in Turkey, the USSR was quick to respond by placing missiles in Cuba. The missiles also served to threaten the U.S. and protect the Cuban Socialist Revolution, and this ultimately sparked the Cuban Missile Crisis. In addition, the Cuban missiles on the island served as a defense mechanism against the U.S., due to the fact that the U.S. had also stationed missiles in Turkey that could hit the USSR. The USSR wanted that same security. The Cuban Missile Crisis was eventually seized by the USSR after the U.S. threatened to invade Cuba. Castro was outraged at the betrayal of the USSR and felt that they had not adequately defended Cuba by withdrawing. Throughout his regime, Castro often talked about his ideas of internationalism and anti-imperialism. His first act of internationalism was sending support to the National Liberation Movement in Algeria. When Algeria gained independence from France in 1962, Cuba and Algeria formed a close relationship. Following this, Castro's government continued with its internationalism and provided military support and health care through workers, doctors, nurses, and soldiers to differing socialist movements and leftist governments in Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Panama, Grenada, the Dominican Republic, Africa, and many more. The relationship between these countries is actually quite interesting. They each use each other in an effort to retaliate and for leverage. The USSR leverages Cuba in terms of having a communist country so close to the United States where they can station things like missiles. The Cuba leverages the USSR and its power in an effort to grow and to practice, things like internationalism. And the United States leverages its economic power over Cuba in terms of placing embargoes. The relationships and the diplomacy between all these three nations tends to be very retaliatory in nature, and leveraging in nature, leveraging what they have, leveraging what they don't have, in an effort to gain power. After this disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, Cuba took a nosedive for the worst. Without Soviet support, Cuba was left without fuel, favorable trade agreements, and military and diplomatic support. The economy collapsed, but the U.S. continued to find ways to attack the revolution. The Bush administration managed the Cuba Adjustment Act, which granted any Cuban who touched U.S. land legal status. This caused many Cubans to flee the island in refuge. In 2008, Castro finally seceded and refused to accept another term, ending his reign as the dictator of Cuba. To this day, the embargo is still in place in Cuba, and Cuba still practices both socialism and communism, with the economy being state-controlled. Due to Cuba's relationship with the USSR, however, this state of being was only possible due to Cuba's relationship with the USSR. They were able to develop as a socialist nation without the United States taking over through leveraging the USSR's global power. Castro's actions with the USSR helped decolonialize the area from American powers, and the United States has retaliated and is still retaliating to this day.